When Evan Parker first saw the listing for the ranch, he felt a rare certainty settle in his chest, as if the universe had finally decided to hand him something good. He had spent years caught in the machinery of city life, endless commutes, overpriced apartments, and a sky that never quite got dark enough to reveal the stars. The ranch promised the opposite: open fields, crisp air, and the quiet freedom he had been craving. It wasn't just a home, it was an escape. The property lay on the outskirts of a small western town called Red Bluff. 60 acres of rolling land, a sturdy farmhouse built in the '80s, a barn that needed a little work but held a rustic charm, and no visible neighbors for half a mile in any direction. He imagined weekends spent tending to a vegetable garden, mornings watching the sunrise from the porch, and evenings where the loudest sound would be the chirping of crickets. It was everything he had been working toward. After closing the sale, he loaded his belongings into a rented truck and drove across 3 state lines with a renewed sense of purpose. His dog, Scout, an aging but mischievous mutt, sat in the passenger seat, occasionally lifting his head as if approving the adventure. When they arrived, Evan stood for a long moment in the driveway, taking in the sight. Weather-worn fencing lined the property. Pine trees swayed lazily in the wind. The house's white paint had faded to a buttery cream. To him, none of the imperfections mattered. They only confirmed that this place had history. And now, it would have his. The first week was filled with blissful work. He repainted the porch railings, set up his tools in the barn, walked the land until he knew every dip and rise by memory. The local feed store owner welcomed him like an old friend when he bought supplies. A few neighbors he met in town mentioned hearing about the sale and congratulated him, though they each wore a strange, sympathetic expression he didn't understand. Red Bluff had always been known for its peculiar social culture, friendly enough on the surface, but secretive in ways only small towns could be. Yet Evan thought little of it. He assumed they were simply adjusting to the idea of someone new settling on land that had remained untouched for years. On the 9th day after moving in, the first sign of trouble arrived. A crisp envelope was wedged into the slats of his front door. The return address bore the emblem of a homeowners association, Red Bluff Ranch Estates HOA, a name Evan had never encountered during the entire purchase process. Confused, he opened the envelope and read the contents. It was a welcome package, though the word welcome was printed in a thinner font than everything else, as if begrudgingly included. The letter stated that by becoming a property owner in the district, he was now automatically enrolled in the HOA. There was also an itemized invoice. Total: due $17,450. Due date 30 days from notice. Evan blinked several times, convinced he must have misread something. He scanned the list. Annual maintenance fee road, usage fee community, beautification fee, new member onboarding fee, covenant compliance deposit. Many of the charges made no sense, especially since he lived miles from anything resembling a community, shared road, or beautification project. And a deposit for covenants? Covenants he had never even seen. He set the letter aside, telling himself it had to be a mistake. Maybe they had the wrong property. Maybe the previous owner forgot to opt out of something. He intended to call one of the numbers printed below, but life on the ranch was demanding. Repairs, tasks, and errands piled up. A week passed before he finally remembered the letter again. A second envelope arrived, thicker this time. The tone was entirely different. This one came labeled, Legal Notice, Delinquent Account. The total had already increased by $1,000 with threat of monthly penalties. The letter outlined the HOA's authority to enforce compliance, issue fines, and, most terrifyingly, place a lien on his property if he continued to ignore payments. Anger churned beneath his shock. He had purchased a ranch specifically because it was not under an HOA. His realtor had confirmed it. The property listing explicitly stated no HOA. There were no shared amenities, no clubhouse, no governing board. Just land! He called the number on the letter. The woman who answered introduced herself as Margaret Wexley, HOA president. Her voice was clipped and dismissive, as though he were interrupting something important by asking perfectly reasonable questions. She informed him that the HOA jurisdiction extended across several privately owned properties, including his, due to a historic deed rider. When Evan asked for documentation, she deflected. When he asked what services he was supposedly paying for, she said that community standards must be upheld whether he valued them or not. And when he asked why he hadn't been informed before purchase, she claimed that ignorance did not grant exemption. The conversation ended with her stating that failure to pay would result in escalated enforcement. Evan slammed the phone down, pulse hammering. Something about the situation felt entirely wrong, not just inconvenient. He dug through his closing paperwork, searching for anything mentioning the HOA. Nothing. Not a single line. His title insurer and real estate agent verified the same. No recorded HOA. Scout barked at the sudden movement as Evan paced the living room. Anxiety crept through the excitement that had colored his early days at the ranch. He took a drive into town to speak with some locals he had met at the feed store, hoping for clarity. They exchanged uneasy glances when he mentioned the HOA. One man, clearly nervous, muttered that he didn't want any trouble and excused himself. A woman who had previously been friendly shifted her tone, lowering her voice so others wouldn't hear. She described how the HOA had formed several years back, not through legal structure, but through a group of wealthy homeowners led by Wexley who simply decided they had authority. They operated like a private club masquerading as a governing body. They strong-armed new property owners with threats and legal jargon until they paid. Some residents fought back legally. Others gave in just to make their lives easier. The woman wished Evan luck and warned him to be careful. Returning home, he found a third envelope on his porch. This one was marked Final Notice before Lion Action Balance. Due $23,980. His excitement about the ranch, the fresh start, the peace began to sour into dread. Something had to be done. He wasn't going to let a hostile committee take away the home he had finally managed to build for himself. Evan spent that night researching property law websites, county municipal records, real estate forums. There was nothing anywhere indicating the Red Bluff Ranch Estates HOA had legal standing. No incorporation, no filings, no approval from any governing entity. They existed only through audacity and fear. He realized that if they were going to try to intimidate him into paying fake fees, he needed to fight back with actual law behind him. And if there was one thing he hated more than confrontation, it was being scammed. The ranch, his sanctuary, had become a battleground. But he wasn't backing down. He was going to expose them. He was going to prove they had no authority. And he was going to make them regret choosing the wrong person to bully. Evan woke the next morning with resolve hardening in his thoughts. The sun climbed over the horizon, spilling pale gold across the fields, but its beauty couldn't override the simmering anger that now lived inside him. The ranch was supposed to be his liberation from city bureaucracy and petty rules, not the place he'd discover a new breed of tyrants. After brewing a pot of strong coffee, he began by calling his real estate agent, then the title company, demanding explanations. Both reaffirmed what he already knew. There was no HOA included in the closing documents. No addendums, no covenants, no deed restrictions, nothing. This so-called HOA was invisible to every legal piece of paper tied to his purchase. Yet the letters kept arriving. Each day, a new envelope found its way to his porch. Scout barked at them like they were poisonous snakes. And maybe they were. The balance now soared above $25,000. Threats of lien, property seizure, and even mentions of potential foreclosure were bolded in every message, the font almost gleefully aggressive. Evan realized he needed undeniable proof, not just paperwork others assured him of. He needed something that would stand up in a courtroom, something that could shut down Margaret Wexley and her group of self-appointed enforcers permanently. He decided his next stop would be the county records office. The building was modest, tucked behind the sheriff's department. A clerk named Jonah guided him to the public archives, where he waded through binders thick with decades of transactions. Dust coated his fingertips as he searched for any trace of an HOA tied to his property, or any surrounding parcels. Hours slipped by. Page after page revealed old ranching family transfers, easements for water access, but nothing resembling an HOA or shared governance of any kind. Red Bluff Ranch estates did not exist, at least not in recorded law. Jonah watched him periodically, curiosity growing. When Evan finally explained the situation, the clerk frowned deeply and excused himself. He returned minutes later with a supervisor, a gray-haired woman who carried herself with bureaucratic precision. She confirmed that if such an HOA did legally exist, they were required to file incorporation paperwork with the county, state registration for legal authority, and to provide transparency of covenants to all impacted homeowners. None had been filed, not a single document. The supervisor leaned in, voice lowered in concern. "If they're demanding money without legal standing," she said, "that's harassment, potentially even fraud." Though spoken quietly, the statement lit a spark inside Evan. Fraud wasn't just a nuisance, it was criminal, actionable. He requested certified copies of his deed and all, supporting documents showing the absence of an HOA. He left with a folder thick enough to make a point. But he wasn't done. On his way home, he took a detour toward a cluster of upscale homes that the locals hinted were the headquarters of Wexley's influence. Expensive landscaping, iron gates, and pristine driveways lined the road. The wealth radiating from the place practically confirmed what Evan suspected. These weren't volunteers keeping a neighborhood tidy. They were power-hungry individuals building a kingdom from intimidation. He spotted a sign near the gate of one residence, Red Bluff Ranch Estates HOA Board Office. The lettering was professionally carved, but oddly, the sign wasn't affixed to any official building, just placed on the front lawn of a lavish mansion, fake authority wrapped in pretentious presentation. A camera mounted near the mailbox swiveled slightly as he parked. He could feel unseen eyes on him. He didn't approach the door. Instead, he took photos, plenty of them, evidence of their operation, proof they advertised themselves as an official governing body. As he turned back toward his truck, a voice called from a yard across the street. An older man stood there, arms crossed, watching cautiously. His lawn showed signs of neglect, long grass, wilted flower beds, a stark contrast to the perfect exteriors elsewhere. Evan sensed immediately that this man wasn't part of the board. He approached carefully. The stranger hesitated before speaking, scanning the area like a man accustomed to living under threat. He explained quietly that he had lived here for 20 years, long before the HOA was formed. He once refused to pay their fees, believing it was a scam. What followed was relentless harassment. Legal mail, fines, threats of property seizure. Lawyers grew too expensive. His wife eventually moved away, unable to handle the stress. The HOA had effectively crushed him into silence. "It's easier to give them what they want," he murmured. "Most people eventually do." But Evan wasn't most people. He thanked the man and returned to his truck. With evidence in hand and first-hand testimony affirming the HOA's tactics, his anger had transformed into something sharper. Purpose. His phone rang as he pulled onto the rural road home. The caller ID displayed a name he already dreaded: Red Bluff Ranch Estates HOA. He let it ring once before answering. Margaret Wexley's voice poured through the speaker like oil, smooth but poisonous beneath the surface. She spoke as if they were old acquaintances, but every sentence dripped with condescension. She informed him that since he had failed to respond to notices, his fines would accelerate. A special assessment fee, another invention, raised his balance to $40,000. She mentioned that their legal team was preparing to file a lien within days. Her confidence teetered on arrogance. She clearly expected compliance, fear, submission. But Evan said nothing. He didn't argue, not yet. He simply ended the call and stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. They thought he was alone, vulnerable, easy to intimidate. They were wrong. That evening, he spread his newly gathered documents across the dining table. Certified legal forms showing no HOA existence, photos of the sham headquarters, notes from his conversation with townspeople. Every piece of evidence formed a puzzle that painted the HOA for what it truly was. 4. Delusion of authority sustained by bullying. He researched attorneys in the area, particularly those who specialized in property law. One name appeared repeatedly in success stories: Alicia Grant, known for crushing fraudulent claims with courtroom precision. Her office was in the nearest city, about an hour away. Evan penned an email laying out the situation and attaching a few of the most blatant documents. Before going to bed, he stepped outside, breathing deep the night air. Stars glittered brilliantly overhead, the exact piece he came here to find. Scout nuzzled his hand, sensing his tension. The ranch was quiet again, but the tension was like static on the air, temporary calm before a storm. A storm Evan was now ready to unleash. He wasn't only defending his home anymore. He was going to stop this group from hurting anyone else ever again. If they wanted a fight, then he would drag them into a battle they couldn't win. Word of Evan Parker's refusal to bow to the Red Bluff Ranch Estates clique spread faster than he expected, like wildfire in dry brush. At first it was quiet. A few curious glances in town, a stray comment at the feed store. But it wasn't long before the HOA's response materialized in the day-to-day life of the ranch with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Their tactics were theatrical and petty, the kind of small-town vindictiveness that assumed silence or surrender would follow. It began with the trash. Someone, or some group, had systematically tossed plastic bags filled with refuse at the edge of his driveway, night after night. Evan discovered them at dawn, the white bags stark against the prairie grass, each one heavy with the kind of household waste that spoke of intentional malice. He photographed and removed them, but the next morning there would be more. Scouts snarled at the shadows where the intruders must have stood, and Evan's stomach tightened. Then came the flyers. They arrived under the windshield wipers of his truck and pinned to telephone poles down the highway. Grainy, anonymous pamphlets with headlines accusing him of everything, from illegal dumping to harboring dangerous animals. The images were doctored. A picture of a different yard littered with junk was labeled as Evan Parker's property. The pamphlets demanded community vigilance and urged neighbors to report him to authorities. The board's signature was absent, but the reach felt unmistakably orchestrated. Margaret Wexley's presence shifted from the written notices to the in-person visits. She appeared at the feed store, the hardware, and once, brazenly, at his own driveway. She was always immaculately dressed, the picture of civic dignity. Her smile was mild, her tone honeyed when neighbors were around. When she confronted Evan in his own yard, the smile hardened into something sharp. She accused him, politely, of breaking obscure county codes. Codes Evan later learned were misquoted from an unrelated municipal ordinance. She claimed complaints had been lodged about unapproved modifications to his barn. and excessive noise. Her voice suggested a neighborly plea, but the underlying message was clear: conform or be crushed. A sheriff's deputy came one afternoon, not in response to a direct complaint from Evan, but because of the anonymous pamphlets and a call reporting suspicious activity on his land. The deputy's questions were perfunctory. There was no probable cause, only the echo of rumors. Evan answered calmly, laying out the facts: his ownership documents, permits for the renovations he'd performed, and proof of his payments for utilities and taxes. The deputy left with the impression of a man trying to mind his own business. But the damage lay in the narrative crafted by others. In Red Bluff, narrative had always held more power than truth. Evan's inbox filled with messages from strangers. One email, anonymous and taunting, included a photo of his mailbox with a note: "We're watching." Another contained a thinly veiled threat about consequences for those who defied the community. He started to sleep with a lamp on downstairs, the house feeling less like sanctuary and more like a stage under constant surveillance. Pressure mounted not only from harassment, but also from attempts to fracture his relationships in town. The boutique owner, who had seemed friendly, suddenly crossed the street when he walked by. The feed store clerk became distant, apologizing in whispers that people in power had a way of making things difficult. The older man who had warned him earlier now avoided Evan's eyes, as if fearful his association might bring trouble. The HOA's social capital worked like a virus. It didn't need legal authority to poison daily life. Evan kept a meticulous log. Each incident, the trash, the flyers, the in-person confrontations, the emails, was dated and photographed. He compiled names, times, and any witnesses possible. This compulsion toward documentation stemmed from a mix of practicality and principle. He would not offer them the silence they relied upon. Every petty action was a thread he intended to pull until the whole fabric unraveled. When he finally secured a meeting with Alicia Grant, the property attorney whose name had echoed on forums and talk boards as a bulldog for homeowners' rights, the timeline sped up. Alicia was direct and exacting. She had a legal mind that saw patterns others missed. She explained the strategy in blunt terms: obtain a temporary injunction against the HOA's harassment, demand proof of any claimed authority, and, if necessary, bring a civil suit for damages and fraudulent practices. Her office compiled a packet of letters, notices, and the evidence Evan had collected. Within days, a formal cease and desist arrived at the HOA's ostentatious mailbox, a letter demanding an immediate halt to all intimidation and false claims, signed and ready for court. The response was, predictably, theatrical. Wexley issued a public statement, distributed via an email list that seemed to have an unnaturally wide reach. Evan was a disruptive newcomer, undermining long-standing community standards. She framed herself as the protector of neighborhood values, invoking maintenance of property values and communal safety. It read like a press release from a private kingdom defending its borders against an invader. When Alicia filed for an injunction, the HOA's retort escalated into something legally absurd. They produced a stack of documents purporting to show that Evan had agreed to covenants during the purchase. The stack looked official at first glance, stamped, signed, and typed. But under scrutiny, it unraveled. Dates didn't align. Signatures appeared suspiciously similar to one another. One page referenced an entity that hadn't existed at the time it was supposedly signed. The county clerk who had helped Evan earlier examined the papers and raised an eyebrow. "This is sloppy," she said. "If they're forging documents, they're doing it without finesse." The HOA's next move was even bolder. They attempted to record a notice of assessment with the county recorder's office, a legal maneuver designed to create the illusion of an enforceable lien. Alicia moved quickly, filing an emergency motion to block any such recording. The county accepted the motion for review, noting irregularities in the HOA's filings and requesting further verification. For a precarious week, the threat of an official lien hovered like a storm cloud. Meanwhile, the smear campaign persisted, an online forum filled with lurid accusations about Evan's character, claims that were as fantastical as they were coordinated. Someone even created a video montage of clipped news footage and misattributed photographs, narrated in the tone of an exposé. It gained traction among local social media circles, chipping away at Evan's support and making his day-to-day life more fraught. Yet amid the pressure, something unexpected happened. Cracks appeared within the HOA's ranks. A younger board member, restless and less committed to the group's heavy-handed tactics, messaged Evan anonymously with an apology and an offer to help. He confessed that he had felt uneasy about their methods and feared the law would not look kindly upon the way they operated. The plea was cautious but sincere. "We didn't think someone would fight back like you did." Evan didn't celebrate this small victory with fanfare. He replied with measured gratitude, but warned the young ally that safety was paramount. He couldn't afford to escalate into vigilantism. The law had to be the instrument that dismantled their operation. Still, the message signaled vulnerability. The HOA's cohesion relied on fear and conformity. When that began to falter, their power frayed. As the legal wheels turned and public opinion lurched like a pendulum, the atmosphere around the ranch tensed into something resembling a pressure cooker. Papers were filed, motions circulated. The local grapevine pulsed with speculation, and verdicts rendered by those who preferred gossip to facts. The case was no longer merely about money. It had become a spectacle. A David and Goliath narrative playing out in the dust and squinting sunlight of rural life. Evan had always imagined his retreat to the countryside as an escape from drama. Instead, the ranch had become a battleground, the stakes growing higher with every calculated move the HOA made. He kept thinking of the older neighbor who had lost so much to these methods and of the younger board member's trembling confession. The fight had become about more than his property. It had become about the future of the town itself. He slept poorly, dreaming of courtrooms and foreclosure notices, but beneath the fatigue lay an unyielding conviction. He was no longer simply defending a house. He was challenging a system built on intimidation, and he had chosen the strongest weapon available to him: truth, backed by law. Outside, the prairie wind picked up, and the barn's loose tin clattered like a distant drum. The ranch waited, patient and unbowed, as both his opposition and his resolve gathered for the next phase. Autumn crept into Red Bluff like a slow-turning page, crisp mornings painting the ranch in shades of amber. But even as the season offered beauty, tension bound itself to every quiet hour of Evan's days. The legal battle had progressed beyond cease and desist letters. Now it had entered the slow grind of official scrutiny. The county recorder's office had begun investigating the legitimacy of the HOA's filings. Alicia Grant scheduled the initial injunction hearing before a judge known for his impatience with frivolous claims. The ranch still suffered nighttime harassment. Tire tracks marred the dirt road each morning, imprints of vehicles that lingered just long enough to intimidate. Scout growled more often, his ears perked toward the tree line where headlights sometimes vanished at the sight of a porch light turning on. Even the barn, that symbol of fresh beginnings, showed signs of tampering one morning, its latch marked with scratches from a forced attempt. Nothing was stolen. The fear was the message. Through it all, Evan remained steady. Worried, exhausted, but steady. He continued collecting evidence: photographs, timestamps, archived emails, and legal correspondences. He documented every incident, stacking proof like ammunition. He knew that in the courtroom, every detail would matter. Word of the impending court hearing stirred the community. Coffee shop gossip brewed speculation. The older residents, long cowed by the HOA's influence, watched with a mix of fear and fascination. Younger families whispered cautiously, unsure which side of history they would soon witness etched in local memory. The HOA, on the other hand, leaned deeper into theatrics. Glossy pamphlets and email blasts declared that the community's integrity was threatened by one man's refusal to support collective well-being. They called themselves protectors, guardians against the urban decay they insisted Evan represented. But something had shifted. Instead of blind support, a few curious voices began asking questions. If the HOA was official, why had no one ever seen valid documentation? Where exactly were the funds going? Why did dues only seem to increase? In a town where gossip spread quickly, doubt spread faster. The younger board member who had messaged Evan before reached out again. This time, the message was longer, more urgent. He revealed that Wexley had been funneling collected fees into accounts tied to her private real estate ventures, using the HOA as both shield and sword, leveraging compliance to maintain inflated property valuations while profiting behind the scenes. Her strategy was genius in its simplicity. Invent fees, enforce compliance through intimidation, and collect without oversight. Worse, the HOA board had no rotation, no elections. Board members were hand-picked to ensure loyalty, an inner circle sworn to Margaret's authority. Any dissent was extinguished before it could spread. This insider information transformed the case entirely. Now, it wasn't just a fight over property rights, it was a case of fraud with financial motive. Alicia's team widened the scope, drafting a formal complaint accusing the HOA of operating illegally, committing document forgery, and engaging in racketeering. The stakes had escalated beyond local squabble into criminal allegations. The week before the hearing, the HOA's desperation became unmistakable. 3 identical certified letters arrived, each bearing escalated fees. The total now exceeded $200,000. The document claimed retroactive assessments, compounded penalties, and costs of legal inconvenience. It was laughable, but only in a tragic sense. They were trying to bury him under a pile of made-up debt, hoping that a number so terrifying would make him fold. That same evening, a black SUV idled at the edge of his property for nearly an hour. Its headlights remained off, but the silhouette of the vehicle was outlined enough beneath the moon to track its presence. Evan called the sheriff's office, but as soon as the deputy car approached, the SUV vanished into the rural dark. Proof of harassment without possibility of confrontation. Their favorite tactic. Alicia reassured him that every new tactic only reinforced their case. The bigger their overreach, the more ridiculous they appeared in legal light. Still, fear lingered in the quiet patches of the night. The barn creaked in unseen wind, and Evan wondered more than once if he had brought trouble not just upon himself, but upon his peaceful dream. Yet every time doubt crept in, he thought of the older man who had lost his peace, his finances, and his marriage. All because the HOA had chosen him as a target. Evan would not become another casualty. The day of the preliminary injunction hearing arrived colder than the day before. Frost clung to fence posts as he made the drive into town. Alicia seated calmly beside him, files neatly organized in her briefcase. She had prepped him for possible outcomes, realistic yet confident. Scout remained home, pacing the porch as if aware the day held importance. The courthouse stood small but imposing on Main Street, its brick exterior weathered by decades of disputes, both petty and profound. Inside, wood benches creaked under the weight of curious locals who had come to witness the confrontation. This wasn't just law. It had become theater. Margaret Wexley entered flanked by 2 board members, their expressions pinched with indignation. They carried folders stuffed with paperwork. No doubt the same forged nonsense that had been dismissed by county officials. Margaret held her chin high, as if entering a coronation rather than a legal proceeding. When the judge, a stout man with silver hair and a reputation for zero patience with nonsense, took his seat, the atmosphere tightened. The clerk announced the case: Parker versus Red Bluff Ranch Estates Homeowners Association. The judge's brow lifted skeptically. As if the name itself already smelled of fabrication, Alicia presented first. She outlined the facts clearly. No legal incorporation, no filed covenants, fraudulent demands for payment, harassment escalating to physical trespass. She submitted certified county records proving the HOA did not exist in any legitimate form. Then came the evidence of intimidation: photos, videos, timestamps. The judge's expression grew darker with each detail. Finally, Alicia submitted the anonymous testimony from the younger board member, redacted for safety, explaining the forged documents and illicit financial funneling. The judge requested a sidebar, flipping through the pages with keen disgust. When it was Margaret's turn, she confidently delivered her narrative. She spoke of community, standards, values. She waved official-looking documents as if they were gold-edged commandments. But when asked for filed incorporation paperwork, legal authority, or public records showing HOA jurisdiction, she repeatedly deflected. The judge asked one decisive question: "Ma'am, are you telling this court that you are enforcing laws that do not exist?" Her face tightened. Her mouth opened, but no answer came. The silence was thunderous. With a single amused exhale, the judge leaned back and delivered his decision. Temporary injunction granted. All enforcement actions by the HOA. Immediate halt. No lines may be filed. Financial demands suspended pending further legal review. And then, as a final blow, he added that the court would be investigating claims of fraud and harassment by the HOA leadership. Somewhere in the back of the courtroom, someone snorted in barely concealed laughter. The tension that had been suffocating Red Bluff fractured into whispers of surprise and stifled smiles. Margaret Wexley's face flushed crimson. Evan didn't gloat, but relief washed over him so powerfully that his knees nearly buckled. The fight wasn't finished, but the tide had turned. He had taken the first victory. The injunction hearing had cracked the facade, but the real battle unfolded in the months that followed. What had once been whispered suspicions within Red Bluff now became loud demands for accountability. The judge's ruling was the spark that lit a bonfire. Townspeople who had long lived under the HOA's oppressive shadow realized that fear had been their only shackles. Now they watched eagerly to see if the chains would finally break. Alicia Grant moved swiftly. She filed civil claims seeking damages for harassment, attempted fraud, emotional distress, and property interference. The county prosecutors opened a parallel inquiry into potential criminal violations: forgery, racketeering, extortion. That last word, extortion, echoed through the investigation like a bell tolling the end of a reign. Margaret Wexley and her loyal board did not go quietly. They attempted to sway public opinion with new flyers emphasizing civic duty, but fewer and fewer people listened. Local businesses stopped posting HOA notices. The sheriff's office, now aware of their tactics, cut off cooperation entirely. Their threats rang hollow, and when fear evaporates, so does control. The younger board member, who now revealed himself as Andrew Hemsworth, agreed to provide testimony in exchange for witness protection from retaliation. His statements offered detailed insight into the organization's internal operations. He explained how Margaret targeted new homeowners first, those without established roots. She would isolate them socially, pressuring surrounding neighbors to participate in collective scrutiny. Once a victim felt alone, the fees came next. Those who resisted, like the older man down the street, faced a campaign of escalating financial punishment until they broke. Andrew's testimony didn't just support Evans' claims. It peeled back the entire skin of the HOA monster. The final trial was scheduled for early winter. By then, frost had glazed the ranch each morning, and Scout had taken to sleeping nearer the fireplace. But while the world outside cooled into stillness, the tension building in town heated to a fever pitch. Everyone knew the trial would decide more than Evan's home. It would determine whether Red Bluff could shake off years of intimidation and reclaim its sense of community. The courtroom was packed the day proceedings began. Reporters from nearby cities arrived to cover what had become an emblem of rural corruption. Homeowners who had once trembled in silence now lined the benches. Ready to watch justice take aim, Alicia presented her case like a practiced conductor. Every piece of evidence a note in a symphony of legal condemnation. She demonstrated the lack of incorporation filings. She highlighted signature mismatches in forged documents. She introduced bank statements, obtained via subpoena, showing tens of thousands in fees transferring into accounts tied to Margaret's private LLC. When Andrew took the stand, he spoke with remorse, weighing every word. He detailed meetings in Margaret's mansion, discussions about aggressive collection strategies, and orders to falsify legal-sounding paperwork. He admitted to fearing consequences, not law, but social exile. Red Bluff had a way of making dissent feel like exile from the only world that mattered. By the end of his testimony, many in the room weren't angry at him. They were angry that the HOA had created an environment where decent people felt they had no choice but to partake. Margaret's defense crumbled before it even began. She tried claiming misunderstanding, then ignorance, then victimhood, grasping for moral high ground as if shifting enough blame could stop the floor from collapsing beneath her. But with every excuse she gave, the judge's stare grew colder, more unimpressed. In the final moments of trial, when the judge invited closing remarks, Alicia said only one thing. This was never about community. It was about control and profit at the expense of the vulnerable. Silence soaked the room as the judge signaled his decision. The verdict was decisive and devastating. The Red Bluff Ranch Estates HOA was declared illegitimate and dissolved. All fines and fees demanded from homeowners were voided. Margaret Wexley and 2 senior board members were found liable for fraud and harassment. Criminal charges, including forgery and extortion, would proceed. As he read the verdict aloud, a ripple of relief passed through the room. Some gasped, some smiled, a few quietly cried. Years of anxiety dissolved into sudden freedom. The judge closed with one final unforgettable comment. It is the finding of this court that authority must be granted by law, not proclaimed by ego. This association was never anything more than a delusion, a costly one. To demand $200,000 in fictional fees? Frankly, the court finds that laughable. A brief, stunned pause, and then laughter filled the room. Actual laughter. Even the judge cracked a reluctant grin. It was over. Finally, officially, undeniably over. Outside the courthouse, people gathered around Evan. Those who had once kept their distance now shook his hand, thanked him, called him courageous. He saw the older man from the street, the one who had lost so much, and the relief in that man's eyes struck deeper than any legal victory. One small act of resistance had multiplied into a revolution. Andrew approached too, tentative but hopeful. He apologized again, but Evan told him there was nothing more to say. Andrew had chosen truth in the end, and that mattered. As the crowd thinned and cameras retreated, Alicia gave Evan a rare smile. "You didn't just protect your property," she said. "You saved a community from living in fear. That's no small thing." Evan nodded, overwhelmed but grateful. The ranch would finally become what he had always dreamed, a place to breathe, to grow, to heal. He drove home with the windows cracked, letting winter air sting just a bit. A reminder that he was alive, that peace now came earned rather than assumed. When he reached the ranch, Scout rushed out wagging wildly, Sensing victory despite not knowing the details, Evan stepped out into the quiet expanse of his land, untouched, unclaimed by anyone but him. The barns stood still, the trees swayed in gentle approval, and for the first time in months, his breath didn't carry the weight of anticipation. No envelopes waited on the porch, no SUV watched from the shadows, no lies threatened his peace. The ranch, his dream, had survived the storm. And in Red Bluff, the stars looked brighter than ever.